So we'll start out by saying welcome everyone to today's Eden Nap webinar. Today's webinar is entitled Critical Gen AI Literacy in Online Education. So with the recent rise in the use of Gen AI in all levels of education, it's important for us as educators and academics to understand the impact of these systems, what they can bring to the table, and how both we and our students can become competent users of such technologies for the benefit of academia as a whole. So I'll start with a couple of introductions, just both to myself and the speakers for today. So I'm Mark P. McCormack. I'll be the moderator for this afternoon's session. I'm a final year candidate of a PhD in Maynooth University, focusing on research on the use of generative AI in teaching assessment and practices. I'm particularly interested in the application of systems for collaborative tutorage in guiding and nurturing students' learning for improved learning outcomes. We have a wonderful group of presenters today. We have Dr. Maria Avgarinu. Dr. Avgarinu has taught, published, and presented extensively on the research and practice of online and blended learning, has done action research and visual literacy for education and training, with a particular emphasis on teacher education and professional development. We also have Dr. Sissi Crisula Karakitso, who has been a member of the Derry Psychology faculty since 2000, teaching undergraduate and postgraduate courses on developmental psychology, qualitative and quantitative research methodology, and supervising thesis projects. We also have Dr. Irene Kariani. Dr. Kariani is an assistant professor of psychology at the American College of Greece, a fellow at the ACG Center of Teaching and Learning, and affiliated faculty at the Center of Excellent Food, Tourism, and Leisure. We have Konstantinos Lefteriostis, who expertly blends academia and industry. They are a lecturer in higher education, teaching business intelligence, enterprise systems, and GIS, actively enriching his courses with industry insights through guest speakers and practical workshops. And finally, we have Anastasia Logothetti, who has been teaching literature and writing courses for more than 3 decades. She studied in the US as a Fulbright scholar and holds a doctorate in contemporary British literature from the University of London. Just a quick idea of how this session will happen today. So our presenters are going to speak to you about their presentation. That should take about 50 to 45 minutes. We may or may not finish a bit early on this. The latter part of the session will be devoted to any Q&A. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, there is a chat feature on our Zoom call. You're more than welcome to place questions throughout the presentation into this chat. And at the end of the session today, I will be asking the presenters some of these questions. So if we have about 10 minutes at the end, or perhaps more time, depending on when the presentation finishes. So if you have any questions throughout, feel free to drop them there, and I'll be happy to ask them at the end. So with all that out of the way, Maria, I will hand it over to you for the presentation.
Okay, welcome everyone. Let me just share my screen with the slides here, and we can then start with our first presenter, who is going to be Dr. Irene Kariani.
Hi everyone. So before we start, I'd like us to pause for a second. So when you hear the term GenAI or ChatGPT or Gemini, what comes to mind? You can write your answers in the chat if you wish. Let's see. The first image. I need you to write the first image that comes to mind. Efficiency. A mental image instead of words. Large server room, yes. Mobile phone in exams. Oh, okay. So, whatever image comes to mind, I want you to remember it, because actually it matters more than you think. Can we go to the next slide? Okay. So consider what our students encounter daily. GenAI can be visualized as a co-pilot in a learning dashboard, a glowing digital brain on TikTok, a robot assistant embedded in writing tools. All these metaphors, visual metaphors, mirror underlying emotions. For example, uncertainty, hope, skepticism. This emotional framing helps explain why we might embrace AI as a co-worker, or maybe why we even resist it. However, these metaphors have been critiqued as oversimplifications. They can mislead us into viewing GenAI as an autonomous entity, or they can highlight the opacity, the distortion, and the bias inherent in the technology. If we can move to the next slide. Okay, here we see some visual metaphors that often compete in public and academic discourse, such as GenAI as plastic waste or pollution, highlighting the environmental concern, or a stochastic parrot, fluent, however not really grounded in meaning. Next slide. So, visual metaphors are not just neutral aesthetic choices. They shape our expectations about GenAI's role, reliability, and intelligence. The central issue is that these metaphors can often go unchallenged, even though they do have implications for learning, for teaching, and for practice. So when GenAI is seen as a co-worker, maybe it can invite overtrust or even misplaced delegation. When this is framed as a black box, it can trigger avoidance, negative feelings, even panic. The choice of metaphors used to describe GenAI can really determine whether it is perceived as something empowering or as a threat. So our argument is simple, really. Students and educators, they need the ability not only to decode GenAI imagery, but also to interrogate the ideological, cultural, and technological assumptions that are embedded within this imagery. So, to address this, we examined literature from 2023 to 2025 across academic and public discourse in the intersection of three domains: visual literacy, education, educational technology. And we identified three thematic categories: anthropomorphism, framing GenAI as a human; opacity, or something that is disruptive, a game changer. Grounded in our work in theoretical and empirical literature, we aim to demonstrate how these visual metaphors influence our trust, our skepticism, how we perceive it, and so on. So our goal is to contribute to a definition of critical GenAI literacy by emphasizing the role of visual metaphors in shaping perceptions and affecting ethical and practical engagement with GenAI in online learning. So to take us deeper into foundational concepts and the critical theory behind our framework, I will now pass the floor to my colleague, Dr. Avgerinou.
Thank you, Irini. So let me begin with, as Irini said, with some theory on visual metaphors, visual literacy, and then we'll also discuss critical GenAI literacy. So let me begin with a simple premise that our brain trusts images faster than it trusts words. We live in a world that where thinking is increasingly visual and where visual literacy is an important skill set. The term visual literacy refers to the ability to understand, interpret, create, think, and learn through images. It recognizes that visuals are not decoration, they are part of how knowledge is constructed. We just don't see images, we reason with them, and we remember through them. Cognitive science shows that visual and verbal information are processed together, and images are encoded more easily than text. That means visuals don't just support learning, they shape what feels intuitive and believable. One of the most powerful tools in the field of visual imagery, pedagogy, and inquiry is the visual metaphor. A visual metaphor lets us see an idea. It connects the abstract to the familiar, and when AI is shown as a brain, for instance, as a co-pilot or as a helper, complexity becomes less complicated. The metaphor reduces cognitive load and facilitates understanding. Education has always relied on metaphors and visual metaphors. With scaffold learning, we also describe education itself as a journey. We design learning ecosystems. These metaphors don't just explain education, they shape how we imagine that learning works. But there is a turning point. Douglas Kellner's critical visual literacy reminds us that images are never neutral. Visual metaphors don't just clarify reality, they frame it. They embed assumptions about intelligence, authority, and power, as Dr. Karagianni mentioned earlier. And because our brains accept visuals so quickly, those assumptions go unchallenged. And this is where Berger sharpens the argument. He states that the relation between what we see and what we know is never settled. Our brains want images to feel stable and trustworthy, but Berger reminds us they never are. Every image is filtered through culture and power. So when learners encounter GenAI visuals, they are not just processing information, they are absorbing narratives at the speed of perception before critical thinking even begins. That's why questioning images is not optional. One could say that it is cognitive self-defense. And now moving on to critical GenAI literacy and how it builds on the critical visual literacy, always in connection to generative AI. So if images reach the brain before skepticism does, then the question becomes, how do we teach learners to slow down perception? Critical GenAI literacy could offer an answer. Rowe and his colleagues define critical GenAI literacy as the ability to critically analyze and engage with AI systems by understanding their technical foundations, societal implications, and embedded power structures, while at the same time recognizing their limitations and biases. This literacy is not about mastering tools. It is about interrupting automatic trust while applying reflective and socially responsible engagement. GenAI doesn't enter education as a code, it enters education as an interface, as an icon, and then as a metaphor. Students meet AI visually before they meet it in real technical terms. Critical GenAI literacy teaches them to pause and think, asking themselves, what am I being shown? What am I being encouraged to believe? And what remains invisible? That pause is where agency returns to the learner. And now I'm giving the floor to Dr. Lovothati, who is going to talk to us about metaphors in educational technology, and then the
Thank
metaphors
you.
that we have identified. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. As my colleagues, Dr. Karagianni and Dr. Avgerino already established, creating generative AI literacy is neither simple nor evident, but it is something that certainly has to deal with the fact that using metaphorical language to discuss a very new kind of technology like GenAI, it has to take into consideration that ever since technology entered education and we've been dealing with what we call a tech, we've had metaphors shape our understanding of technology in education. And what you see on the screen is some of the very common categories of metaphors that we've been using throughout our engagement as educators with technology by either building the notion using scaffolding metaphors, talking, of course, about the tools that technology offers, connecting our engagement with technology and education by using journeying kinds of metaphors. And of course, the broader notion of ecosystems is also something that we've been using in education. So now we're being called to deal with a very new technology and a very different technology, but some of these metaphors have already created the space within which we engage with new metaphors. If we can change the slide. So as you heard, we looked at literature from 2023 to 2025, and we find that, broadly speaking, we can place metaphors of GenAI in two broad categories, and that they are categories that feed off one another, but also very much determine our feelings and our attitudes toward GenAI. On the one side are those that anthropomorphize artificial intelligence. They give it characteristics that we associate with sentient beings. And then there are those that stand opposite this trend, and they try to counteract such attitudes of anthropomorphism, and they try to present AI in ways that it shows lack of any emotion or intentionality or human style comprehension. Let's look at this in more detail. So various studies present and also talk about the complications that different kinds of metaphors suggest. So when somebody connects, as Sam Altman did very famously, tools like ChatGPT with calculators and uses the term calculator for words for ChatGPT, there is an oversimplification that suggests that you have in your hands a tool that is very, very simple, like a calculator. But when you have those metaphors that use terms like collaborator, assistant, intern, as you also see on the screen, that suggest a human entity that has intentions, that has consciousness, that communicates and may communicate in language that is natural, but on the other hand also has the sentience that goes with it, then you have a misleading metaphor. The metaphors that are used for generative AI do not need to be only anthropomorphic to create emotion. The very famous use of black box, as Dr. Karayani earlier said, could create negative emotions. If, on the other hand, you use something that may be associated with distortion on the one hand, but something that is also fun, like the funhouse mirror, again, you can have very misleading, you can convey very misleading attitudes. The use of the term hallucination, which also anthropomorphizes, is something that, again, a lot of researchers and educators have pushed against. And it may seem that something like an echo chamber may be safer, and yet it also suggests that there are distortions there. So you see how these categories complement each other, and how the same metaphors may exist in more than one category. So there are those scholars that have always been very cautious toward anything that is essentially a tool that offers probabilistic results. This is where the very famous stochastic parrot metaphor comes from, while the drunk intern that anthropomorphizes and is a little playful, because the idea here is that you cannot entirely trust AI, generative AI, but at the same time, it looks like something that may be to some extent unpredictable, like a human being, like a drunk intern. Against that is the idea of a brain without a mind, or digital plastic. And you saw the image of digital plastic on our third slide earlier. Are these safer because they counteract anthropomorphism, but as long as they give us a mental image, replacing the more complicated understanding of generative AI, they can also be misleading. Well, we're going to talk about a specific recent study, if we can look at the next slide, which was published early last year by Oster, McCaleb, and Mishra, and it offers a very useful framework to understanding generative AI metaphors. So what this team did is create a spectrum of metaphors ranging from the non-anthropomorphic to anthropomorphic by placing a variety of metaphors, and they give an awful lot of examples. This is definitely one source that you may want to look at if this is a topic that interests you, going from metaphors that are like tools, the aforementioned calculator or the Swiss Army knife, to those that suggest some degree of anthropomorphism in turn, but not as powerful as the notion of an assistant. And then you can even go from an assistant to a mentor or a genius. These are all metaphors that exist in various studies and that people use. And then you even have those metaphors that are extremely anthropomorphic, and they suggest a higher entity, a godlike creature, a mythical creature, the robot overlord. What this team and what this framework suggests is that each of these categories, and this is a 7-level or 7-tier spectrum that they offer, so it's quite a rich and complicated arrangement, but it suggests how important it is for not only students and educators, but also policymakers and those that look at higher education institutions in terms of attitudes toward generative AI. The next slide gives you a visual that essentially gives you a few more of the metaphors that the team uses to show you how the gradations exist. The key idea here is that we absolutely want educators and students to be aware that there is nothing uncomplicated, not only about these tools, but also about the language we use to talk about them, because they influence understanding. I will pass it back to Dr. Avgerinou to continue with our discussion.
Thank you. So I'll discuss the ideological impact, why interrogating those visual metaphors matters. And here's the uncomfortable truth, especially for online education. The most persuasive AI metaphors appear to be the ones embedded in learning platforms. When we see GenAI in an LMS as a friendly assistant, a glowing icon, or an intelligent dashboard, The brain reads competence before it applies caution. Visual familiarity creates cognitive trust, and as a result, trust reduces scrutiny. However, we need to remind ourselves that clarity is accuracy. These systems are trained on complete data sets, they inherit social bias, and yet their visual presentation is in educational environments suggests neutrality and authority. The smoother the interface, the less friction the learner feels. Yet the friction is where all this critical thinking that we want our learners to perform begins. In online learning spaces, visuals are instructional signals. Every icon, avatar, animation, and AI-generated images is teaching something about who controls knowledge and how intelligence is distributed. Without critical visual literacy, those signals become a silent curriculum. They normalize power structures before students ever name them. The risk is not just misunderstanding AI, but also learning to trust it automatically. Our study shows that visual metaphors of GenAI are shaping the architecture of online learning. They influence how students position themselves relative to knowledge. Are they co-thinkers or passive recipients? Perhaps they are supervised interns to a machine. So if AI is framed as an oracle, students defer. If it's framed as a tool, they experiment. And if it's framed as a collaborator, they negotiate agency. These are pedagogical consequences. In digital environments, in particular, metaphors don't just describe technology, they shape learner behavior. That's why critical visual literacy and critical GenAI literacy are educational responsibilities, not optional add-ons. They help learners slow down perception, interrogate interfaces, and question visual authority, and reclaim, of course, interpretive agency. In an AI-mediated world, what protects learning is neither resistance to AI nor blind adoption. It is agency, not engagement. And with that, I will give the floor to my colleague, Kostas Lefteriotis, who will talk about the pedagogical implications of our study, and then some recommendations on 3 different levels for 3 different groups of stakeholders. Costa?
Thank you, Maria. So, listening about the critical visual literacy and then AI, so there's some things that we should be concerned about. So, what are the implications of our study? Because we were very concerned with what is it that we're gonna push forward with our findings. First of all, as educators, why is this essential? For all of us educators, either learning designers or researchers, policymakers, it's critical visual literacy is not just something nice to have. It's not just a skill. It's essential. Anyone who's working in education today needs to be aware that, as we learned earlier, that visual metaphors are important. We create content, we consume content, we deliver content to our students, and therefore we don't need to just teach them how to use the AI tools. This is about competency. We are actually talking about literacy, the power to be able to interrogate, to demystify them and say, okay, why do we have this kind of content? Why is this kind of output here? What kind of assumptions? What kind of data? What kind of theory was applied so that we have this kind of results? And so, whenever we represent AI as a glowing brain, what does this promote? Actually, really, that we have intelligence. The name itself is misleading. Artificial intelligence. So, need to get back to the basics. This is about ethical and informed engagement. It's not just a technical competence that we're talking about. So in the next slide, for us educators, what are some recommendations? First off, it's about scaffold critical analysis into existing learning activities. So a lot of times, I'm in business education, so we use case studies, and I try to create some visuals that will enable them to, to have a better understanding. But it doesn't have to be about redesigning the course, about small steps. And whenever they see either an animation or a visual, we can actually ask. It's very easy to ask, what does this icon represent? What do you think that it denotes about the capabilities of such systems? Can we actually trust them? It's also about being able to do a comparative discussion. So is a copilot versus black box. What are the differences? Where do we feel in control? Because we have to be in control. And this is the idea. Most of the times when I'm talking with my students, whenever they use such kinds of systems, because they do, and we have discussions about the possibility that those systems fail in their output, some of them still copy paste exactly as is, and then we have a discussion, why did this happen? We had all that kind of discussions. And it made sense. It has been trained on so much data, and it looks like it's all powerful, and I don't have that kind of a knowledge. So demystifying this will enable them to be in a power position, and this is one of the important things. We need to be skeptical. The analysis of such interface elements, so considering to use other forms like neural networks versus humanoid robot faces. Are they objective actually? Is it some sort of a magic? Day one, these are not magic. We're not talking about some sort of wizardry, right? And so this is important about educators, but we also need to say some things about learning designers. And so in the next slide, whenever as learning designers we develop content, we create educational technology, and this is all more important because it goes to larger volumes of people, so it becomes even more important. It's about the intention. It's about the intention. Why are we using whatever it is that we are providing to our audiences? Why are we selecting a specific image? So the illustration that we're using is actually, we're making an argument. We're telling a story about the use of it. We should try to avoid to mislead the learners in attributing something that they're actually not. And sometimes it gets very, very difficult, especially with things that are new, when we implant that kind of ability to those systems, and it's a lot harder to take it out, because we have the tendency to stay relaxed and let somebody else, we offload to somebody else to do the job instead of us. Human control versus the computational nature and capabilities of those systems should be distinct. We should not anthropomorphize. And as Anastasia said earlier, Dr. Logothetti, is about demystifying that's important. So yes, that was about the educators and the learning designers. And now specifically about online and educational and digital education. How do we start? So first off, it's about making a priority about critical visual literacy. It should be embedded in a visual analysis. It should be a core competence, not just something that we should have in our curriculum. Not something like it's a point that we also need to learn. It's something that we should use as a method of engagement. And we will engage with those visuals, because now it's masses, we don't know who created what. And therefore, our students, our audiences are exposed to such kind of material, and trying to figure out how we can go about it. And having that in mind, what kind of policies, what kind of research should we go about? Now, this is still new. It's the last 2 or 3 years that we've started working with it and identifying about generative AI, mostly because this is what it's about. So we need more research. We need the research to try and find out how those visual metaphors impact on students, on their understanding, on the decisions that they make to offload some of the tasks that they are assigned, to offload their knowledge, their skills, and their ability to work properly later on. So because that actually impacts. What about the workplace of tomorrow? Policymakers, the narratives and the educational uptakes, we need to be aware. So the guidelines that we provide on our platforms, the procurement decisions, the standards that we have to place. It's not just about colors or the fonts or the layouts. It's about what do they represent. So they're actually influenced by those frameworks, even though unconsciously. So it's not just about academic theory. This is very, very practical. And as we move on more and more to online learning, they become more and more important with respect to their impact. And trying to put everything back together, feeding from my colleagues, those visual metaphors actually shape the way that we comprehend GenAI. And we tend to simplify things, and that kind of simplification hides behind it the concepts that actually are embedded into our understanding, and that makes it all more difficult. So it's about beliefs, it's about our emotional responses and technology adoption. This ability of influencer framings, the ideological weight, and the ability of people to understand what's happening. Some of us think, some of our students think that okay, they can do everything, and I can have time to do something else. So those telephones sitting in the exam, they take a completely different role now. And very, very important is that pedagogical shift. We've been seeing a lot of effort trying to see how we will respond to this in this new era. And most importantly, it's about interrogation. Interrogation about the way that GenAI is visually and metaphorically framed. Who actually constructs those? I think most of these visuals that are humanizing AI, they come from a long way back, trying to go down to the person who probably is not educated and doesn't understand a lot, but that's where we create the problems. And that has impacts on both social and ethical. So many of us who are involved in this, all as stakeholders, that we have this ability of reframing this discussion and changing the way things are, and try to make something better. So it's not about whether the visual metaphors matter. Is do we actually have the knowledge? Do we actually have those skills to engage with them critically and make something important with our students? And with that, I will close. Thank you very much for your attention. Any questions? Thank you, Maria.
Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for such a lovely presentation, guys. If anyone has any questions on anything in the presentation, feel free to add them into the chat there now. If you want to address a particular question to a particular speaker, you can include that in the chat and I'll be sure to address it as such. So if everyone would like to start adding questions to the chat, I can communicate them as such. Okay, while some people are entering in questions, I have a question of my own. So just regarding the critical use of Gen AI and the literacy, especially in our pedagogical practice, as was noted towards the end, I'd like to get your guys' opinions on how you maybe would speculate the future will go with this. I mean, a lot of the research now obviously focuses on what we experience, what we have seen in the past 2 or 3 years with generative AI technologies. Do you see our assessment practices changing in any significant ways between now and say the near future of maybe 5 or 10 years? And if so, do you think that there'll be particular practices that perhaps will need to be integrated into different disciplines, or just if there's anything that maybe could be general for all a cross-disciplinary approach? I'd like to get your guys' opinion on that.
I can start us off, and then other colleagues can jump in. So one of the things that we've seen and traced by looking at the research, but also press, is that a lot of institutions, predominantly in the US initially, then in the UK, and much later in Europe, were eager to engage with generative AI, eager also to suggest, after perhaps initial bans, that faculty change their assessments and that they try to make the most of generative AI tools and the affordances and so on and so forth. What has been happening more recently is that those that have adopted perhaps were among the earlier adoptions. What we see now is a kind of pushback. On the one hand, suggesting that they are seeing some disengagement and that they are finding that traditional or the more popular ways of using generative AI in assessment is not working as well as they had hoped. So I think we're still reacting as a community of educators, and some of these reactions that we've seen also have to do with more emphasis on not only authentic and in-class work, but oral forms of assessment. So certainly a variety of reactions, and this is still something that is developing. So maybe another of us can also take this up if they want.
That was a very good answer, yeah.
If I can jump in here as well. So a lot of the things that we do in terms of assessment is not something radical. We have those ways of assessment for quite a few years, but we start off rediscovering them in the advent of GenAI. It does seem, in my experience and from literature, that experiential learning is becoming very, very important. Also, teamwork has also become quite important. The easy answer would be to go directly to exams, but we will be missing that kind of skill and pedagogy that other forms of assessment, because assessment is not just about placing a mark, but also learning in the process. It is a process. And therefore, all those ways of having assessments like study analysis, teamwork, authentic assessments, these are still very, very valid ways of going about it. If we are going to use some of those tools, it has to be done with skepticism and very, very careful planning. I think that this is how we should be thinking about it. And I think many of us have seen it in their courses with students. It's not about demonizing or saying, okay, here's a free ride, go and do whatever you want.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We have another question from Martine in the chat. So the question says, any idea how we can teach high school students about this topic or an activity to do with them? It sounds mind-blowing, but at the moment, I can't think of anything to do with them to teach them about the topic. Do you guys have any thoughts on this?
Well, perhaps I can jump in. Good afternoon to all. I mean, with high school students, we can start presenting them with various images, various portrayals of AI, and encourage some brainstorming regarding what they feel, what they think this is about, and it is the best way to be done in a group, so as various students that exchange ideas regarding what is actually portrayed by using a particular symbol. The best way it is to start with concrete and then to moving on to much more rhetorical and critical representations. representations which underscore the duality or the complexity of what is portrayed. So instead of demonizing or underscoring the enhanced potential, engage in a much more constructive discussion. Another way is to allow students to understand what they're gaining and what they're missing by working with such a tool. I mean, it's a collaborator, but how it can be used to the best to empower and use all the potential that students have and enhance that. For example, some reflective practices, instead of prohibiting the use, is encourage the use within closely monitored process, like what can you to give an activity and see what students can do without the use of such tool, with the use of tool, and then develop some reflection regarding how they can what they earn by using it. These are kinds of reflective activities that we use anyway with our students without the use of AI tools. What this is a metacognitive practice, what I have learned, what I have achieved, and what I would do better if I'm given a second chance to do it. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks so much. We have another question from Dara in the chat who says, thank you very much for a very thought-provoking presentation. Where do you see the development of CVL fitting into higher education curricula outside of education and digital media programs?
Hi, if I may take this. Critical visual literacy and then critical visual literacy as well as media literacy can be embedded both in face-to-face traditional and online education. When you're using the visual media and you ask your students to you ask questions, you're kind of helping them to understand that what they say may not be as kind of free of value or any ideology or anything else. And so in that case, you help them to kind of develop and apply their critical thinking skills in order to be able to see behind the image and even interrogate their own perceptions and understandings, which come from their cultural backgrounds, for instance, their social groups, and so on and so forth. So, for instance, in my classes, and I teach in this Learn Design program, I have I give students various opportunities because those learning designers will need to come ready to the market, not just knowing how to use the technical aspect of GenAI, for instance, but also how to use it in an ethical, in a responsible way, and to their benefit. And so in that case, there are many different opportunities where, for instance, they will be engaging with assignments that they will need to go do exactly this, go read between the lines, go behind what we say, the scenes, and interrogate their own assumptions about the visuals that I will that I have presented them with, and be them metaphors or any other visual like avatars and so on. I use a lot of visual metaphors even in my research methods class, in order to get people to share with others, actually identify themselves, their biases and preconceptions about, for instance, research, and then share with others what these are and how they could improve their view of research now that they have understood their biases and so on through the use of those visual metaphors as a medium. And by the same token, use the same kind of activity in the online teaching and learning class with the visual metaphors that students have for GenAI. So there are many opportunities if you want to embed the development of critical visual literacy first, and then critical visual literacy skills together with critical GenAI literacy. You can ask ChatGPT, you can ask any of those AI tools with the right prompting to give you more ideas, and then see how you can adjust them to your own curriculum and the learning outcomes that you're trying to achieve with a specific age group.
Wonderful. Thank you for such a really good answer. We have one more question here from Anila in the chat, who asks, do you think critical visual literacy related to Gen AI can be included in foreign language classes?
Shall I just take another step? I guess. Okay. So yes, definitely. Because here you when you learn another language, you're learning the kind of the culture of the language, social conventions and so on that relate to that language, and therefore, yes, it's a critical Gen AI visual literacy, and Gen AI definitely can help there, because students, for instance, could check what visual metaphors are used by different in different countries, okay, and then they could try and explain the use of those metaphors vis-a-vis the culture of the country, using, of course, the language, that second language, and so, or that foreign language, and so definitely yes, I would. I'm not a language teacher, but I would use it that way.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We have another question in the chat from Stavrula, who asks, do you think that critical visual literacy can be helpful for adults and minor students in an evening high school?
I can jump in here. All of these questions show how each one of us, depending on the level of education we're at, depending on the discipline that we serve, we're trying to find ways, and we wonder the degree to which those tools affect our own discipline, our own level of education, and then, of course, how they affect the different ages of learners that we have. And the broad answer that we've been giving to these different, more focused questions is yes. And one of the things that we try to do today is show how, regardless of discipline, regardless of background, regardless of age, that we tend to think in metaphors that carry a positive value or a negative value, and that we very rarely have neutral attitudes when it comes to generative AI. Because generative AI converses in natural language, in what seems like natural language. So it seems as if there is some kind of, human behind the machine, or a human-like consciousness behind the machine. And the other thing that was very interesting and I don't know how conscious the companies were in the marketing of these tools from the beginning, is that the windows that we write the prompt in and then we get the responses and look like messages that we exchange on mobile phones. And that also gives the impression that there's something human behind it. So no matter what age of education, you certainly have somebody who, and Costa said this before, outside the classroom already has experiences. So the answer to should we try to create visual literacy to our students and critical visual literacy so that they can understand what these tools do and how they feel about these tools, that metacognitive level, and be more reflective in the way they talk about them and think about them, the answer is we should do that yesterday. So regardless of what level you're at, what discipline you're at, who your users are, we're all in this together. We're all learning together. So finding very small activities that will allow you to start a conversation. You remember we started our discussion today by telling you, give us one image that for you suggests artificial intelligence. And that is the simplest way to engage any audience at any age. What do you think of? And the answers are going to go from, a little robot with a human face to some kind of machine and everything in between. So we are really suggesting that you are bold and that you absolutely engage all learners one step at a time, small steps, and that as your learners react, you see your own preconceptions as well, because all of us have attitudes and they determine the language that we use to discuss artificial intelligence. And we
Wonderful.
hope that today you've learned some more things about it.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think that's a really good note to end today's session on, and we're almost very close for time, so that's really, really good. Just before we finish up, again, I'd like to thank each of the speakers today, Maria, Konstantinos, Irene, Anastasia, and Chrysula. Thank you so much for a wonderful and insightful presentation today. Thank you again to the Eden App Steering Committee for helping to organize this. And thank you everyone for joining us today for such a wonderful seminar. So with that, I'll conclude the session there. Thank you again to all the presenters. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you for having us.
The next
Thank
webinar.
you for having us.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.